So I'm the speaker for today, and I just wanted to start out. I do this every 4 years, but I wrote this essay, I think, for the 2004 election, which was shortly after Red Bank Humanist was founded, and I tweak it to be still up to date each year. But let me just oh, another thing. So I get questions whenever we verge into vaguely political sort of territory. I get questions, are we not supposed to do that? We're a 501c3 tax deductible organization. And here's the way this works. So there's the foundation for law on this is actually something called the Johnson Amendment, which is named after Lyndon Johnson. And back in 1954, Lyndon Johnson, when he was then in the Senate, proposed legislation which was passed into law, that if you're a nonprofit organization, to include churches, but also other nonprofit organizations like ours, you are not permitted to endorse specific candidates for office and perform blatantly political activities. However, we are allowed to talk about issues and advocate for issues and encourage people to get involved in those issues, encourage people to vote, and educate our membership and all that sort of stuff. And that's what many nonprofit organizations do across the political spectrum. So fear not, we're not going to be violating the Johnson Amendment. There actually has been discussions on and movement among movement conservatives for a long time now to try and actually remove overturn the Johnson Amendment, pass new legislation that would get rid of that limitation. And in fact, Trump has been quoted as saying that he wishes to quote, get rid of the Johnson Amendment, freeing people to advocate for specific candidates from the pulpit. But we as humanists value the separation of church and state and value the notion that there should be a degree of remove between an organization like ours and blatant political activities. So I'm going to give you some suggestions. I'm going to tell you how to get involved, but we won't be actually doing the work of politics through this group. All right, so first, how important is your vote? What is it worth? Should voting be a high priority? Let me lay out the case that it is the most valuable use of your time and the most effective way to help the causes that you care about. Let's start with the money. This November, 160 million people will vote. Their votes will control $25 trillion in federal spending over the next 4 years. The difference between the major parties is typically a shift in taxing and spending priorities of about 10% of that amount, but that's still $2.5 trillion over the next 4 years. And that yields a net value of $15,000 per vote, derived solely from control over federal spending. Considering state and local spending that you can influence by votes you cast on the same trip, that's another $12 trillion controlled by those votes, worth another $8,000. Sticking with money matters, the election outcome also affects economic policy, which attempts to foster economic growth and influence the distribution of wealth that results. Wealth can be redistributed to the poor and middle class through progressive taxation, social programs, public services, antitrust enforcement, and regulation. Or wealth can be redistributed to the rich through tax cuts, privatization of government functions, corporate welfare, public land use concessions for resource extraction, like grazing or mining, and so forth. Liberals and conservatives disagree on how to make the economy grow, but both believe that their policies are the best for growth, as well as the best at directing income to those who truly deserve it. The value of economic policy is comparable to the value of federal spending, yielding another $15,000 per vote. So altogether, the financial impact of a single vote is about $38,000. So think about that when you think about how easy it is to get in your car, go to the polling place, or vote by mail, or whatever you do. Now let's consider the social policy implications of your vote. The outcome of the election will determine the direction of lawmaking and law enforcement and will affect the composition of the Supreme Court, as we've noticed. The broad effects of this government activity will be to expand the freedom and opportunity of those represented by the victors and to restrict the freedom and opportunity of those represented by the losers in the election. The sweep of concern is vast, but includes crime and punishment, health and security, environmental stewardship, reproductive rights, equal protection under the law, freedom of conscience and of expression, promotion of your values at home and abroad, international cooperation, war and peace. Your vote has a tiny impact on enormously significant choices that your government will make on your behalf, which will affect all of us. As freedom and opportunity are actively managed, either by liberals or conservatives, it affects not only one court case, or one victim, or one triumph, it affects all of us. One vote out of 160 million that collectively determine U.S. policy towards all Americans and everyone else around the world is equivalent of a vote that by itself determines U.S. policy towards 2 people in the United States and 50 others in the wider world. So when you consider the worth of your vote, you should value it as if you were able, with that vote, to fully control our government's influence over your family and a dozen other families sprinkled throughout the world. So that would be a family in the Ukraine, 2 families in China and 2 in India, a family in Zimbabwe, a family in Afghanistan, a family burning the rainforest because existing crops don't earn them enough, a family suffering from AIDS for want of sex education, a family sick with tuberculosis for want of vaccines or antibiotics, a family sending their sons to a madrasa and keeping their girls at home for lack of public education. Of those 60 people, some will be affected strongly by our government policy, while others will barely notice. But one will be either freed and fed, or angered and radicalized. So how important is your vote? Well, it's worth nearly $40,000, and the value of the government treating your family and a dozen other families around the world properly. So the stakes are high indeed. And then here's a postscript for our era. The election is not just this election is not just a typical battle between Democrats and Republicans. In the past, the 2 parties shaded the truth, but were guided by truth. Both parties, by different degrees, tried at the margins to bend the rules to their advantage, but both played by shared rules and examined and observed time-honored norms of behavior. This year, it is different. This year, it is science versus conspiracy theories, truth versus lies, good government versus a cult of personality, human rights versus white supremacy, hope versus fear. The rule of law is on the ballot. Fair play is on the ballot. Justice is on the ballot. Voting may seem small, but it is the only constructive way out of our nightmare. You may doubt that your vote will be decisive, but there is no doubt that it will contribute to the margin of victory and the magnitude of the rebuke to those who would destroy our society. You will always remember this vote and your part in history. All right, so now on to getting my sheet open and to the presentation and from the beginning. All right, so this talk is about Project 2025. Everybody by now has probably at least heard of it and something about it. Maybe some of you people already know nearly everything I'm going to present, but we're also going to have some opportunity for discussion, and you can add your own understanding and points about Project 2025. So I'll start with the book itself. If you watch some of the news coverage of the Democratic Convention, or if you've seen some of the ads, they have this giant book. Well, it doesn't have to be that giant physically, but it is that giant in terms of its ambition. It's a 900+ page policy document for Project 2025. It has detailed guidance and proposals for every federal department and agency, and mostly what it's encouraging new Trump appointees, new Republican appointees to do, is to cut back funding, eliminate programs, allow governments to opt out of various federal mandates and take control. And if that's a red state, that would be a state where Republicans control, all three branches of government, and will take policy in a very conservative direction. And when given the chance to take control of a particular, human welfare policy, they'll just say, we don't really want to do this anymore, or we'll do this at a 20% level rather than at a 100% level. There's also lots of guidance to bully blue states by withholding funding into changing their local policies and limiting what states that have democratic control of the government can do in terms of protecting the environment, limiting greenhouse gas emissions, protecting civil rights, etc. and so forth. So that's mostly what it is. And literally, there are subsections for everything with some fairly detailed policies. I was thinking of trying to take a snapshot of one page, but when I was looking at it, it was not going to be very useful to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. But I have glanced at it, and it is detailed. So that book, its title is Mandate for Leadership, and in fact, it is the 8th in a series of this book. The original version of it was prepared in 1979 and published in 1980, and it was a guide to the incoming Reagan administration. As you know, Ronald Reagan was not a detail-oriented guy, and he actually sort of made he was sort of proud of the fact that he was, just a big picture guy, and so he needed a lot of guidance for actually implementing conservative policy. And that's what this was. It was the handbook. It was pretty outside the political mainstream at the time. So the Heritage Foundation is always pushing the envelope, and they're still pushing, so that now the sort of things that they've got in this book would not have been in their wildest dreams back in 1980. But they themselves claim that 60% of their over 2,000 proposals were actually implemented during Ronald Reagan's first term. And most of us, I think, are old enough to remember how impactful the Reagan Revolution was, and how many changes the folks like Edwin Meese and James Watt and all these people who we thought were just zany guys, and they were all guys, what they were doing to dismantle federal agencies and their ability to regulate business and protect the environment and all that stuff. Remember, Clarence Thomas was picked to head the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and destroyed it. So in the 7th edition, which was the immediately previous one, there's this line in here that says it was longer than previous editions, in part because much of their progress had been lost during the Obama administration. So they had to do some catch-up. But again, they claimed that the Trump administration embraced almost 2/3 of its policy proposals. They were not as effective in initiating and implementing them because Trump was just such a dumpster fire, I guess. But they did enough. So that's the book, which is number 4 on this slide. So there's a general, there's an even overarching playbook. There's a database of far-right loyalists, so that they basically have this Rolodex of people that they can sift through and decide, okay, who should run this agency, who should run that department, who should we put as their deputy, and they've got a whole bunch of people to replace all the, not only all the cabinet positions, but way down into each of these agencies. There's what they call a presidential administration academy to train these people and give them the tools to understand where the levers of government are to advance their agenda. And then, of course, there's the big book. Some of the goals are to curtail reproductive rights in the interest of banning abortion and relegating women's role back to the way it was in the middle of the last century, to end any efforts to combat climate change and protect the environment. So it's not just global warming stuff, but it's also like eliminating regulations on polluting the water and the air, and all sorts of efforts to take the handcuffs off of business, as they would say. This says end public education. That might be a little overstated, but I'm sure there are folks in that movement who really do effectively want to end public education. But they certainly want to cripple public education, try and encourage people to leave it for subsidized private education, and more to the point, spend a lot less money on it so that they don't have to stump up the taxes for it. This says persecute. I guess that's really not too far from the truth, right? So they really want to eliminate any sort of non-traditional gender identities or expression, and restore all the stigmas that have been eased over the past, over my lifetime, right? Certainly to allow people to discriminate on a variety of basis, to effectuate some sort of mass deportation of people who've immigrated into the country irregularly, reduce immigration generally, although only from the ESO countries, right? It's not, if you're coming from, what was it, Norway? So there's that. And also to expand presidential power. You've probably heard of what the right calls the unitary executive theory, which basically says that the president should have pretty much direct control over all federal agencies, and that he is the governor, he is the king. That's coming directly from this, and they've been working on this for decades to try and push these things forward. So it's not just this year. So, among other things, restrict people's freedom on when to start and grow their families. Eliminate the Head Start program. That's really high on their list for some reason, even though it's not a big budget item, but they really don't like the notion of helping young, minority, or poor children get ahead of it. They'd rather those children be serfs or servants or, a lower class that they can exploit for very low wages. Eliminate the child tax credit. Repeal the new caps on prescription drug prices. They used to be very free trade, but they've gotten on the Trump train and are now interested in imposing tariffs as a way to relieve the tax burden on themselves, to collect the money through a tariff that everybody pays, then it's a non-progressive tax that they can then fund the government with rather than income taxes and other things. They certainly don't like the student debt relief programs. They want to erode access to health care. In many ways, this talks about restricting Medicaid and Medicare eligibility, but also to eliminate subsidies for the Obamacare, ACA healthcare exchange, and harder to sign up and harder to stay on, and eliminate consumer protections. This talks specifically about the housing market, but they're not particularly in favor of consumer protections in general. They want the freedom to rip off the American people, essentially. Other impacts are cutting overtime protections for over 4 million workers, so that's reclassifying people so that they're no longer eligible for time and a half when they are asked or required to work overtime as a condition of their continued employment. They want to limit access to food assistance, so this is used to be called it's SNAP and Temporary Assistance Needy Family. They have all these new acronyms, but it's basically the food stamp program, which was unquestioned for many, many decades because there was this alliance between farmers and their farm subsidies and taking those surpluses and subsidizing poor families' use of those surpluses. But that consensus is broken down of late. Restrict access to medical abortion by enforcing rules against shipping it across state lines, among other things. Push people who are otherwise enrolled in Medicare towards these advantage plans, which look really nice in the advertising, but often end up costing people more. Mentioned reducing the Obamacare subsidies, and allowing the federally funded but religiously affiliated child care agencies to discriminate in who they allow to adopt children from their organizations. There's threats to deny federal subsidized student loans to states that provide in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants. So that's an example of, remember I mentioned that the federal government can withhold funding in a way to force states to comply with their agenda. So they're saying, okay, if you don't stop doing this in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants, we're not going to allow federal dollars to go to subsidize student loans for students in your state. And then, of course, they want to roll back civil rights protections across multiple fronts. They want to eliminate funding for what used to be called internal improvements, key public transportation projects, roads, bridges, trains, high-speed trains, remove the safety net for farmers, and they're not particularly interested in removing the subsidies for the big agriculture, but they are interested in the programs eliminating the programs that are specifically there for small farmers when their crops fail or they have other major impacts to their livelihoods. I guess I won't read all of these, but the number of things go on and on. So there's been some effort. Donald Trump has said, I don't know anything about it. What is this project going to about? I've never heard of it. That's not me. And so some of his cronies are trying to rebrand it as Agenda 47, but it's basically the same thing. And it is expected that there'll be more euphemism and walking on eggshells around it because it has now become unpopular. We've been successful in demonizing Project 2025, but they will try and duck and cover. And in many ways, a lot of this agenda has already been implemented in the previous Trump administration and by courts that have been stacked with very, very conservative, very, very disruptive judges. So, for example, this is it's referred to just as Chevron in the among constitutional scholars. This was a court decision back in the 80s that basically established a principle that when a court is looking at some sort of issue before them, they're to give a degree of deference to federal agencies, assume that they're making good faith efforts to implement the law, and only challenge government policy when it is strongly, obviously violating some other principle of the Constitution. But a recent Supreme Court decision just this past June overturned this. I forget what the actual case was, because we all know Dobbs as the case that overturned Roe v. Wade. But in any case, that case, they basically threw out the precedent of deferring to federal agencies, and so now they're encouraging the lower courts to look at the issue and really insist that the federal agency prove that they're not, why what they're doing should be the way it is, and defer to the aggrieved parties' freedom to pollute, use natural resources that are in the common domain for their own private benefit. Whenever they're doing that, the courts are supposed to, not, favor basically favor the industrial interests at the expense of consumer protection or environmental protection rules that are not explicitly legislative but are merely, invented by the government agency trying to implement a law. So let's see. Another thing was this recent Trump versus the United States decision where presidents and former presidents are granted criminal immunity for their official acts. And that's not absolute, but it's changing the standard, or I shouldn't say changing the standard, because this notion of presidential immunity had not really been tested in the courts, but now it's been tested in a very unfortunate way, and the sort of fondest dreams of the unitary executive theory folks who want the presidents to be very, very powerful and untouchable and above the law, they got their wish with this decision. And here's a little quote from Justice Sotomayor's dissenting decision on the chip. Well, I guess I can read the short paragraph. Never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe that he would be immune from criminal prosecution if he used the trappings of his office to violate the criminal law. Moving forward, however, all former presidents will be cloaked in such immunity. If the occupant of that office misuses official power for personal gain, the criminal law that the rest of us must abide by won't provide a backstop. In which he writes, with fear for our democracy, I dissent. So that's sort of in the courts, also at the state level. So in states where conservatives control all three branches of government, they tend to push the envelope on these efforts to roll back affirmative action, or what is now referred to as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, to ban abortion and enforce those laws in very strong ways. All of these things are at play at the state level. And so it's very similar to the more liberal states like California or Vermont will experiment with universal health care or experiment with legislating gay marriage at the state level or legalizing marijuana or various things like that, the more conservative states are pushing the envelope in the opposite direction. So it gives you a sense of what might be implemented at the federal level were things to turn against us in the next election. So, why is Project 2025 counter to humanism? So, for one thing, it promotes religion and favors authoritarian Christianity in particular. So it's not even even-handed among religions. It restricts personal freedom and freedom of thought, and that's everything from reproductive rights to trying to impose a sort of Christianity first principles in public schools, banning votes, all that stuff is counter to our human principles. It limits collective effort to make society better on a variety of ways, such as protection of the less fortunate, protection of the environment, promotion of liberty and justice for all, efforts to provide care and education, so public education, the Affordable Care Act, efforts to mitigate disease and dangers, vaccination, regulations to prevent workplace accidents, all that stuff is things that they would rather not have the government involved in. And efforts to remedy disadvantage and provide opportunity for all. So, what can we do? So, you should get out and talk to people. You don't have to wear your politics completely on your sleeve, but when the opportunity arises, bring up the coming election and encourage people to prepare themselves so that they don't miss the opportunity to vote because at the last minute they don't know where to go or don't know how to do it or have some other emergency come up. Maybe they should vote early or vote by mail. So here's a little set of primary suggestions for if you do want to get involved. So in order to volunteer for a political campaign, it's best to get involved early if you have the time and want to make a bigger impact, take on more responsibility. But it's never too late. You can show up and a week before the election and get involved. So my suggestion first off is the best way to do this is to contact your local party organization, whichever party you belong. You can reach directly out to the candidate's campaign office, a candidate who you really believe in, who you think needs your help. Third, you can, if you aren't driven by a particular candidate, and you can work through an advocacy organization that you trust. And if you don't have that window in particular, you don't know which organization you might want to work through, you could just go to a candidate's website and sign up online, and somebody will inevitably contact you, and you can get more involved. But I would say that's probably the weakest way, or the least focused way to do it. I would do it in this order. So formal things you can do. So there's roles for everyone, depending on what you like or don't like to do. If you want to just sit at home and not interact with people, you can write postcards and letters to voters on lists provided by a campaign or a party. There used to be something called phone banking, and people still do phone banking, but a lot of it's now texting, right? So you don't actually have to talk to people if you don't want to talk to people. You can text them. Then there's sort of the back office stuffing of envelopes, that sort of stuff. You can volunteer to provide rides to people on election day, or the early in-person voting. You can staff a voter registration van. You can do the old-fashioned knocking on doors. Early on, it's canvassing to try and find out whether voters are potentially supportive and give them a bit of a nudge. And then in the last week or so, it's all about going to those same people who have visited early, just sort of reminding them to vote and asking them if they have a plan. And focus on Pennsylvania if you can. In 2008, I was really jazzed up about Barack Obama, and I actually did go door to door in Levittown, Pennsylvania. In 2016, I didn't, and it never happened. There's also plenty of informal things that you can do. Talk to people that you know are likely to vote the way you do. Ask them, like, how are you planning to vote? Like, are you going to vote by mail? Are you going to vote early? You know, just so that, because some people really don't think about this until like the last minute, and it's too late to do things. Ask them if they're registered. And get them, see if you can get them to the point where they have a pretty concrete plan. And it is good to do it early because some people, you know, they have every intention of voting, and then on election day, there's a crisis in their life. And, or they get tickets to a ball game and suddenly drop out of you know, from a friend or something like that, like, oh, I gotta take advantage of that opportunity to forget about it. You don't want them to do that, right? Confirm that they're registered to vote. If that's in doubt, hand them a voter registration form next time you see them. Or give them a link where they can get it. And if you really want to be conscientious, you can actually collect the completed forms and send them in for them. That's often called, not ballot harvesting, but there's a word for that. And Republicans have tried to make that illegal, but it is not illegal to collect either absentee ballots or mail-in ballots, or to collect voter registration applications completed and get them in. Because there are sometimes where you have somebody who's either not particularly interested or sort of scatterbrained, and you're like, you know, I can give them a form, but will they really, you know, and they'll say they fill it out, but, you know, if you want, you say, hey, just, you know, I'll take care of it for you. I'll take that off your to-do list. And then you can motivate them by discussing issues that you know are meaningful to them. You can certainly make things more visible, put a sign in your yard, or in highly visible locations, in keeping with local ordinances. There are towns that will say you can put up a sign, but only 60 days before election. It depends on your town. And you can't post things on utility poles and other things like that. That's, you know, there's rules against that, laws against that. So you got to be conscientious about this. But it's a way to let people know that there are people in your neighborhood that you know support what you do, and it gives them a bit more, you know, opens their mind, gives them permission to feel that way too, and it also might even get you to meet some people you might not otherwise meet. Say someone who thinks like you sees that sign, next time you're out gardening, they might, you know, stop by and maybe have a new friend. So that's happened to me, and that's an enjoyable silver lining to all this. You can wear swag, and it'll also help you meet like-minded people. I would, however, avoid swag or bump stickers or whatever on unattended property, because if somebody doesn't think like you, one of the things that they're most likely to do is vandalize unattended property. They're unlikely to assault you in the streets, but if you just have a sticker on your backpack and then you leave it in the, you know, that might be I would not suggest. And then, to sort of wrap this all up, if you don't feel like doing the legwork, you can do the money work. You can give to political causes. So I would advise to donate to specific campaigns instead of political action committees. The political action committees pay more for radio and TV ads, and I think there are other ways that they end up paying more. I think that those are the key ways they pay a lot more than the actual campaigns. They're another layer of overhead, so you're paying for the staff of that committee, many of whom take large salaries to run their political action committee. So I would say PACs are really for wealthy people who have maxed out on the individual campaign finance limit. So, you know, when you're giving more than $3,000, Then you start thinking, oh, maybe I need to be sort of careful about putting my money around different candidates, use PACs or whatever. But very few of us in this room are in that boat. So go directly to the candidates. So whenever you see XYZ victory fund, and there are victory funds on both sides, and many different parties, including third parties, that's a good recipient because those are invariably structured that it's equivalent of a direct donation to the candidate's campaign for the first allowable 3,300. And then just beware of these what people call scam PACs, They're very prominent on the right, and there have been lots of exposés about them, but they exist on the left too. There have been less exposés about things on the left, but I get text messages from them every day. And I look at it, and I look at the link, and it's not Act Blue, it's something else, and I'm like, huh. And then I go to Open Secrets or Wikipedia or whatever, and I look up that group, and Open Secrets says that, last cycle they didn't even exist. Back in 2020 or 2022, they had no discernible presence, and it's like, oh, all right, I don't think so. I think I'll go with something a little bit more that I really have heard of before. And that's really what I've got in terms of Project 2025 and how to react to it. So now I think we can go to sort of open form of Q&A and maybe a little bit of back and forth discussion. I'll keep the slides if we need to go back and refer to any of them, so keep that open. But I guess we're ready for the lunch. Thank you.